Well, thank you very much, everybody. Now, first session after lunch, just to see that everybody is attentive and awake, I'm going to start off with some audience participation. What you see on the screen behind us is two countries. One that people describe as ambitious, high-tech, and unemotional. Another one which is described as unpredictable, aggressive, and highly emotional. Okay, from the audience, who'd like to guess country A? Yes? Anybody? Finland is country A? Sorry? Germany, right? Okay, who'd like to guess country B? Country B, anyone? Italy? Okay, Italy, Spain. Okay, you're all wrong, it was a trick question. It's the United States, right? But country A is how people from Mexico describe the United States. Country B is how people from Japan describe the United States. And that's all very interesting, but how does it affect brands? Let's look at a typical, prototypical American brand like Chevrolet. In in Mexico, second place in the market ahead of Volkswagen, which is a traditional Latin American leader. They make some models exclusive to Mexico, and they were up 37% year on year at February 2019. In Japan, they have one dealer, and it's 1.4% of that one dealer's business. They only market 2 right-hand drive models, and their market share was down 25 points at March 2019. So culture is vital, and it's particularly vital for those of us in the audience here who create content. Because you know how it is. You start out with your brand, and you create content that's loyal to the brand. It hits a culture, and that's where it stops. The doors, as the picture shows, are closed. And what I'm going to talk about is how you open those doors in different cultures. We at Hofstede Insights start as a basis for our analysis and are inspired by the work of Professor Geert Hofstede. Now, many of you in the room will have heard of Geert Hofstede, who was in global management at IBM in the 1980s. And he saw the profound effect of cultural differences, but he, being an engineer, said there must be some way to quantify them. And he found that cultures, initially, differed in 4 key ways, then it expanded to 5 key ways, and then 6, and these are those there. I'll go through them. Individualism. In a highly individualistic country like the United States, consumers ask, what's in it for me? In a collective country, say like China, we'll ask, who is it for? So many of my German clients say, if we produce material, content that doesn't have any people in it, we can run it anywhere. And of course, the opposite is true. If you produce content that doesn't have any people in it, then there's the majority of the world where you cannot run it. Looking at masculinity, which is about achievement. Japanese consumers are much more valuing achievement over quality of life, and Swedish consumers are much more about quality of life. Bit of a laugh from the audience, that's very telling. It was Professor Marieke de Mooy who first isolated the fact that sales of luxury goods follow the dimension of masculinity. Long-term orientation. An American CEO, when he's managing his business, will say, what's the dream? What's the vision? A lot of talk about that. A Chinese CEO will say, what's the plan? Where are we going to get the business from? And in a practical sense, here's how I used it in my job for my clients, Mercedes-Benz. Our clients said the S-Class is not sold disproportionately as well in the United States as it is in other places, and that's kind of confusing. They said, well, the United States is not like Europe or Japan. They don't go for hatchbacks and odd-shaped cars. They like big cars. They like big, powerful cars. What's up with that? So we found that the only explanation was cultural. We looked at Gini coefficient, GDP per head, but what really told us what was going on was the dimension of power distance. Are people hierarchical, or are people egalitarian? And as it turns out, the United States is a very egalitarian place. The places where that model sells the best, disproportionately well, are places that have very high power distance, that are very hierarchical, like the Middle East or Russia or China. And so that helped our client make a decision to focus a lot of the product development in China. Whenever we create a brand, we often say we connect with the values of our target audience. When you have shared values, one of the things that you have there is a culture. You have a tribe. One of the strongest and most tribal brands in the Daimler stable is AMG. And here we see two gentlemen who are attending the AMG Driving Academy in Shanghai. And they have joined what AMG calls the world's fastest family. So what are their shared values? What's their culture? What's the culture of, to go back to the title of this presentation, the culture of the Republic of Performance? And this is what it looks like. Thinking about power distance, AMG has its playgrounds in lower power distance cultures, places where you don't have a driver driving you around in the car. But within that, we found that our guys were as much as 37 points higher in power distance. They were much more hierarchical. They liked knowing who's boss, and they particularly liked being the boss. So that when AMG opened its first standalone dealership, that is one that is not attached to a Mercedes-Benz dealership, they did it at Sydney Airport, where an AMG driver can drive in, his car's valet parked, and he can hang out in the AMG private lounge, not in the common old executive business class lounge when he waits for his plane. One of the very important areas is in uncertainty avoidance. Uncertainty avoidance is some cultures are very nervous when things are ambiguous or unpredictable, and others are much more accepting of that. Didn't surprise us to see that our guys, and they were mainly guys who bought AMG cars, were 22% less uncertainty avoidant. They embraced unpredictability. And what's the consequences of that? The consequences of that, very, very interesting. If you think about sport, because AMG is a sporting brand, right? In those high uncertainty avoidance countries, we see movement in sport in a very controlled way. Bullfighting, where you stand and you wait, and then there's a sudden release of energy. You think of Asian martial arts, and also two of the most popular imported sports in Japan, baseball and golf, where you have the weapon or instrument, you hold it, and then there's a sudden release of energy. And you think about the way skiing, classical skiing developed in France, is all about technique and control of your body, compared to the versions of those sports that you see in other places, other less uncertainty avoidant spots. For AMG, this is vitally important to understand because a large part of the marketing concerns racing and Formula One. It's no accident that you have to go back over 30 years before you find a manufacturer's trophy that was given to a country, to a team from a country that was not highly uncertainty avoidant. Think about it. Italy, Ferrari, Honda, Japan, and of course AMG. What does this mean for how you do business in a day-to-day sense? Here we have an instructor at the AMG Driving Academy. He is ethnically German, and he is giving a lecture to this audience about the first thing you have to do when you're driving competitively is to hold your body still. You have to get your body in the right position. And his audience there was a bunch of people from North and South America who were largely playing with their phones. Like, when are we going to get into the thrills and spills? And it was particularly important because we assessed the culture of headquarters AMG. Many of them German, many of them recruited from the finest engineering schools. Not only did they behave like Germans in terms of uncertainty avoidance, but they were actually 12 points higher on that. So we had a particularly important problem. If you go now onto the AMG website, you'll see they have adjusted it so that there is less emphasis on explaining all the technical details and more emphasis on the sort of pleasure of driving. And even the sound of the car, right? It goes without saying, Mercedes-Benz is capable of engineering a car that is both smooth and also a car that goes fast. But our audience didn't quite like that. They kind of liked the idea of the rumble of the engine, so it coughs and splutters a little bit, boom, 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 boom. So what they've done is they've programmed into the chip what's called a programmed misfire. so that when the car is at idle, it does that little bit of spluttering. Boom, 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 boom. So in fact, that's actually a concession to the fact that most of the audience for the cars are embracing of uncertainty. And it doesn't just apply to cars. The last dimension is indulgence. And indulgence, this is how it works. You know, if you see something, you say, oh, I can see something. Yeah, I'll have that. Why not? And a highly indulgent culture like the United States does that. Or you can see it and you say, oh, yeah, I really want that. Should I really? And that affects a number of different things. First of all, it affects the use of consumer credit. Indulgent countries use more consumer credit. Discounting strategies work much better in indulgent countries. It brings you into the market. If you're saying, oh yeah, I want that. Yeah, it's on sale, I'll take it. It's the importance of appetite appeal too. In the Americas, if you look at, say, McDonald's ads, you can see that there's lots of bubbling of bacon and melting of cheese, and it all looks gooey and delicious and all that. If you look at, say, McDonald's ads from Italy, I've seen McDonald's ads from Italy, which is, it might surprise you to know that they're not a very indulgent country. I've seen it where the piece of cheese sits on top of the burger like the roof on a Flintstones house, right? And I look at it because I was born in America, and I say, do I want to eat that, really? And of course, that doesn't really matter because in Italy, a lot of the fast food advertising is about social occasions. When is it right to eat? And finally, if you look at the Charities Aid Foundation World Giving Index, indulgence is linked very strongly to whether you are willing to help a stranger spontaneously. So with all of this, it was extremely, for us at Hofstede Insights, we said we should really look at this and develop a new product which is specifically focused on consumer behavior. And so in 2017, we developed Consumer Culture Intelligence, which is how to unlock global brands. We did it in conjunction with MediaCom. Culture is even more crucial in a digital environment because most of the things that, particularly for our mobile devices, that make it sexy involve hyper-localization. The way you use the digital world is more often dependent on what you want to do in the space around you. The global village, the digital world was going to promise that we would all become a global village. That's actually not true. Consumers have used the digital world to be much, much more culturally, in many ways, isolated. They can bypass globalizing influences. We have found that ethno-linguistic groups are very, very strong in CCI, in consumer culture intelligence, and they form patterns of human consumer behavior. And there's also a generational value change. Values change very slowly, but they tend to change by generation. So that's an environment in which brand tribes thrive. And in the remaining time, I can't give you a full list of all of the things that consumer culture intelligence reveals, but let me just go through some of them very, very quickly. First is the dimension of identity. Are you proud of who you are, or are you restless? Do you always want to change? One of the things that dimension predicts is how many Starbucks per head there are in a country. Because this whole business of, wow, I've got my drink and then I can improve it and I can change it, and what new and interesting thing are they going to put pumpkin spice into this year? That particularly appeals to younger audiences in the United States and East Asia. But it also has a profound effect on brand culture. If you're in one of these flexible, constantly improving cultures, you expect more brand elasticity. Relationship. Do we take power from who we are, or do we take our strength from being part of something bigger? Me and we. And of course, it's very obvious how that would affect your influencer strategy. Does the influencer need to be famous and acclaimed by everyone, or do they need to be an expert, right? It also affects how you talk, the storytelling means that you do. In me cultures, you expect a celebrity to pitch and tell you information about the product. In we cultures, often all you need to do is to say, okay, a famous person uses it, and the famous person never breaks the fourth wall. Emotional, we call this emotions. It means emotional stability or anxiety. Interestingly, emotionally stable cultures use social media much more, right? It's a kind of leisure thing to do. It's not something where you have to keep up, unless, of course, you use Twitter or Instagram, which very highly correlate with this kind of anxiety in a culture. As well, neurotic cultures, we'll call them that, or anxious cultures, click on more ads, because that's where the phenomenon of fear of missing out is strongest. Ambition is whether or not you're interested in status seeking or you're a content culture. And funnily enough, those are the people, even though they're very ambitious, who don't use social media for work. Not so with this dimension of curiosity, which talks about how cultures differ in whether they like to have challenging, interesting information, new ideas, or do they stick to their comfort zone. Again, those cultures that stick to their comfort zone tend to use social media a lot more, except for LinkedIn. LinkedIn, about 30% of the adoption of LinkedIn actually comes from this dimension of curiosity. Am I interested in new ideas? So if you have a LinkedIn strategy, which is more about networking than it is about content, interesting, challenging content, new ideas, then maybe, depending on the culture that you apply it in, you have to rethink that. Shopping. There are some cultures that are really emotionally invested in shopping, and some that are much more utilitarian. And those emotional shoppers tend to be less concerned about data privacy. And in fact, if you're in a place like Russia, which is not concerned about data privacy, you kind of want people to see what you're buying. Then impact, and this is very important for brand purpose. Do we take responsibility for the effect of our consumption decisions, or do we outsource it to brands and governments? Do we expect somebody else to look after that? And that dimension explains where Volkswagen lost share in the wake of the exhaust scandal and where they didn't. As well, that whole business of brand purpose is something you have to be very careful with in terms of cultural differences. Which culture embraces the idea that a brand should have a broader purpose and which doesn't. Some cultures need higher information, some don't. And interestingly enough, or logically if you think about it, low information cultures use voice commands more. They don't go on and want to see the spread of options. Also, they use fewer ad blockers. Ads are actually a pretty good source of information for those cultures. Finally, badge appeal. Do you buy on brand or do you buy on benefit? Some cultures buy on brand, and they're the ones who click through on Facebook ads least frequently, simply because when they see the brand, it's in their head, it doesn't really matter. That's enough message in that cultural context. So that's really just touching the surface. But those kinds of measures are the things that you can use to calibrate your digital dashboards. There will be some measures that you institute in some cultures that are going to be more or less effective, and you can calibrate your KPIs to do that, to adjust that in each culture. It's interesting because one of our new colleagues at Hofstede Insights, Christian Feely, said, there's a difference between cultural trends and culture. Cultural trends are the weather. Clients like to see what's hot and what's happening. Whereas we're more concerned with the cultural climate. Why do those trends take root? And where are they most likely to take root? And which are most likely to succeed? And with that, we can say this is where, with that particular thought, I'm going to leave you with that. That's the way to make sure that your content and your strategies connect with the culture with which you're dealing. And we call that at Hofstede Insights the culture factor, and you can follow it on the culture factor hashtag. Thank you very much.